and turn it over to you, Rabbi, so we can get to your teaching.
Okay. Hi, everybody. We're going to start off this morning with a little music and accompanying video while soak in the flavor of the music for a minute or so. And as you do, you're welcome to say hello in the text and let us know where you're calling in from. And we'll make the connection between the music and Isaiah and the Haftorah after. But I thought it would be a good way to set the tune, to set the mood. I will say I set up all the videos that I'm going to play, the music I'm going to play today from YouTube, and I think I've set it up so that we're not going to see a commercial first. And if one shows up, I'm going to skip it as quickly as I can. So we don't have commercial sponsors, but hopefully it'll be all set. All right, here we go.
Shosayich v'rachaku chomer v'layich yasis alayich Elohayich kimsos chatam al kalav lecha dodi likrat kalav
Okay. That you may recognize is a newer tune of Lecha Dodi, which is in the Friday night service, and it happens one of the verses from this week's Haftarah appears in the verse that I played for you. A personal point of pride for that. The writer of the music and the main singer and guitar player there is Rabbi Josh Warshawski, a rabbi in Columbus, Ohio. But once upon a time, Josh was my student when he was in high school. And I see someone in the text, someone shouted out to Deborah Sachs-Mintz. She was also one of the backup singers there. She is a singer in her own right. And I believe a Grammy award-winning singer, a Grammy-nominated singer. She was nominated for one of her albums. I think nominated. And she's a singer in her own right. She was there too. So thanks for the shout out for her there. You might be familiar with the Lecha Dodi as part of the liturgy, and that's a new melody for it. And we are going to circle back to that because what we're going to be talking about today are a few verses in this week's Haftarah that have found their way into the Jewish musical lexicon in different contexts. So there are two themes to our learning. Well, I guess three themes for our learning today. The book of Isaiah and the Haftarah of the week. That's one. Two is about context, the context in which words show up and what the words mean for us in different settings. We're going to look at how some of the verses from this week's Haftarah appear in different places. And the third theme is music, because one of the places we're going to look at where these words have shown up in the contemporary era are songs. And the arc that ties that together is to look at how songwriters and music writers and our people in general turn to the words of the prophets, both in their original context and repurpose them for other contexts, and they mean different things. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. So here we go. As Mara said, we're in the seventh Haftorah since Tisha B'Av. There's a cycle of 7 Haftarot after the ninth day of Av, which is one of the saddest days on the Jewish calendar, where we mark the destruction of both temples and a number of other historical tragedies that befell our people over time. It's a day that stands out on the Jewish calendar for its sadness. It's a full 25-hour fast like Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, of course, is we fast for repentance, personal repentance, to try to focus ourselves to do better the next year. We fast on Tisha B'Av, mourning the destruction of the temple and the other events. And the power of that day is not just felt Jewishly. It didn't happen this year, but there were talks because Israel had some activity in Iran, for which Iran was going to respond to. And some of the messaging out of Iran was that the retaliation towards Israel would be on Tisha B'Av. Sometimes the enemies of our people have chosen actually to put attacks to cause more destruction on the day where we mourn our destruction. Alas, this year, that did not happen, although it was in the threat. But it's the sadness of that day is known not just within the Jewish calendar, but about Jews beyond that. After Tisha B'Av, we start to think about rebuilding. We start to think about return. And the series of Haftarot that we read on Shabbat, the weeks after Tisha B'Av, all have messages of hope, all have messages of return, of rebuilding, of reconnecting. If Tisha B'Av is a low point for the Jewish people and a time where God feels distant, and we were removed from our land so that it felt like the covenant was broken or damaged. The messages of the Haftarot we read after that are about return, recovery, restoring relationship, coming back and being closer to God. And this, right before Rosh Hashanah, is the seventh in that cycle. It's meant to help change our mood as we go from national tragedy to some inner reflection about personal repentance, and then celebration at the end with the holiday of Sukkot. And these Haftarot fit into that as well. I'm going to turn to the Haftarah and part of it in a second. I just want to place in the chat for those who want, a link to the slides I'm going to show that you can view. I'm going to show them on the screen, so you don't have to go to that link. I know here in our My Jewish Learning community, some of you like to put up the words separately from your Zoom screen, so you now have that link, and you should have permission to see it. And I'm going to share my screen one more time and start the slideshow once again. Give me just a second as I hit the buttons. Here we go. So in the middle of this week's Haftarah come these 7 verses from the middle of the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is speaking to the people. And I said one of our themes today is context. I want to give a little context about Isaiah and the book of Isaiah that will help put this Haftarah and these words into context. In the middle section of the Jewish Bible, which we call Nevi'im, the prophets, there's a set of books that are historical books that tell the story from the settling of the land in the book of Joshua and end with the exile, with the destruction of the first temple, the exile to Babylonia. Isaiah is a presence in those books. He shows up in the court of kings and delivers messages to kings and prophecies sometimes there. But as you know, if you've been a regular in this class, Isaiah has a book, a collection of Isaiah's prophecies in his own right. Scholars have noted, both in terms of the setting in which the different parts of Isaiah, the context in which the different prophecies of Isaiah are mentioned, and the historical events they reference and the language that it uses, that the chapters that are affiliated with that Isaiah who's mentioned in the historical books are chapters 1 through 39, set in the 8th century when Assyria is a threat to the northern kingdom of Israel and ultimately takes it over and exiles the people, and it ends the Northern Kingdom and its monarchy. But the Haftorah that we're looking at this week appears to have been words delivered in the Babylonian community, and not in the 8th century BCE, but in the 6th century BCE. And scholars tell us that they think the book of Isaiah actually has a number of collections in it. One set in the 8th century BCE, as I said, and 1 through 39, and from chapter 40 to the end, chapter 66. We move later in time, 200 years later, when the people are in Babylonia, maybe even right on the precipice of Cyrus's decree that allowed them to return to the land of Israel. And there's a real feeling that the return is imminent, and the themes of restoration are not just consolation, like we call this Haftarah of consolation after marking Tisha B'Av, but a real Haftarah of hope as the people are about to return to the land and feeling the excitement of that change that's coming. So it might be that the writer of these words, the speaker of these words, was also named Isaiah, or it might be also that a collection of prophetic poetry from a different time was attached to the book of Isaiah. We're not sure exactly, and a different day maybe we can dig into this more. But this Haftarah comes from that setting. So the context is the people are in exile in Babylonia after the destruction of the first temple. They were in exile for about 2 generations, about 70 years before they were allowed to return, and the temple is rebuilt. And this is a passage that speaks to return, that speaks to the feelings of we're going to have restoration. And as you'll see with what's here, draws on a number of different metaphors to talk about Jerusalem, the closeness to God, and how that appears. So what I'd like to start to do is read these verses, and as we read and look at these verses, sorry about that. As we read and look at these verses, to note some of the metaphors that are here. And after that, we're going to dig down into 2 verses in particular, and as I said before, that show up in different contexts in the more modern period. So Isaiah says, verse 1, "For the sake of Zion, I will not be silent. For the sake of Jerusalem, I will not be still, till her victory emerge resplendent and her triumph like a flaming torch." The prophet says, I have to speak. I can't be silent, and I have to continue to speak until Jerusalem is restored, until our people's restored in Jerusalem, until Jerusalem in all its glory shines again. And with that, we'll see return to a new relationship with God, or maybe a restored relationship with God. "Nations shall see your victory, and every king your majesty, and you shall be called a new name that God shall bestow." There'll be a new period, right? The exiled people will no longer be an exiled people. They will be perceived not just by God, but by other nations in the world as restored. Their majesty and their glory will come back, and they will be seen right? New king, new nation, restored independence in the land of Israel. Moving on, verse 3, "You shall be a glorious crown in the hand of God, and a royal diadem in the palm of your God." Here's some metaphor about kingly accoutrements, a crown, a diadem, as symbols of this glory and restored relationship. "Nevermore shall you be called forsaken, nor shall your land be called desolate." That's where we are now. We're a forsaken people. God abandoned us. Desolate. The land is desolate. We're not in it anymore. But we shall be called my desire, God's desire, and the land, not desolate, but embraced. So a change in language, as Isaiah will come as a part of this. "For God takes delight in you, and your land shall be embraced." Right? It's not just that, right, that other people will notice this, but the joy that God has for the Jewish people will return. And they'll feel it as a people, and they'll feel it also in a land. Then in verse 5, Isaiah turns to love metaphor, a wedding metaphor. "As a young man embraces a maiden, your children shall embrace you." You here being God, should be a capital Y, sorry about that. As a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so will your God rejoice over you. The return will be a love affair. Like young men and young women embracing each other, like a bridegroom and a bride. there'll be a new marriage, a new commitment, a new joyful relationship between God and the Jewish people. Upon your walls, says the prophet, O Jerusalem, I've set sentries who shall never be silent by day or by night. O you who call God by name, take no rest and give no rest to God until Jerusalem is established and she is made renowned on earth. So what earlier the prophet says will be the future, will be the new restored relationship. It's not just that the prophet can't be silent, as he says in verse 1 about this. He says he places sentries on the walls of Jerusalem. Some commentators say this is a reference to the mourners of Jerusalem who were not exiled, who stayed in Jerusalem and lived a life of mourning. Some see it as a metaphor for people, right, as if they're standing on the walls of Jerusalem, calling out day and night at all times, reminding God to restore the promise. It's almost prayerful here that the sentries who are watching over Jerusalem will continue to shout out to God, will continue to pray, will continue to issue themselves, like Isaiah, this vision of a restored Jerusalem, a restored Israel, a restored people, a restored relationship. And they'll do so until the people and Jerusalem return to its glory, to their glory, until God and the Jewish people come back to the relationship described and envisioned earlier in the Torah, and broken by the destruction and exile that they were experiencing. So context number one for these words are the people in Babylonia hearing these words, giving them hope, maybe encouraging them, like the prophet, to be the sentries on the walls of Jerusalem, or like the sentries on the walls of Jerusalem, to speak up, to use their voice, to see this future, to believe in it, and to help it come to be, by reminding God that a part of God's promise is this restoration. The closer this was to the Edict of Cyrus, and the closer this was to when this was actually happening, it might be something that increased. If it was close to it, it expresses that enthusiasm for something that is imminent. But if it was earlier in the exile, it's something that's still a hope. And that's context number one. The exiled people from Judea who have been for a generation or two in Babylonia, longing to get back and longing to see the restoration and return to glory. In our day, and this Shabbat, when we read this Haftarah, there's a similar theme. But for centuries, this Haftarah was read on this Shabbat at this time of the year after Tisha B'Av. Many of those centuries are people who were again in exile, and not one of 70 years, but one of thousands of years. And the hopeful voice here was not seen as imminent until the rise of Zionism. And this Haftarah was read as a strong voice of prayer, in some ways, to bring into our liturgy, to bring into our annual readings, to bring to the synagogue, to people in reading a selection from the prophets, in these weeks between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah, this call to say, we are like the sentries on the walls of Jerusalem. We will continue to express, to shout out, to sing, to read, to make part of our annual cycle. These words of Isaiah, in hopes that, in fact, in the longer multi-century, thousands of year cycle, to remind God that the promise of restoration is still there. And just like there was a return in the 6th century, there should be a return soon in our day. And there was meant to be a hopeful tone to this, especially leading into the time of year where we stand before God in judgment, but to take a moment to remind God of the promise and the restoration and our desire to be back in a magnificent, decorated, shining Jerusalem, with a renewed relationship with God, where God feels close and we feel at home in our land. We feel that joy, and the nations of the world, like verse 2 says here, will look at us differently. And of course, with the rise of Zionism and the establishment of the state, the context again changes for us. And there are ways in which I think the joy that was felt in the original context in Babylonia began to be felt by Jews as Israel was becoming a nation, as the return was coming, as the state was established, as Jerusalem was built and began to shine again, as Israel became a nation in its own right, and God felt close, and the pride and the shining and the joy and the love that's recognized in these words came back in a different way, maybe a prophecy fulfilled come 1948 and the decades after that as Israel became a state. So a third context for this Haftarah in the last 75 years is seeing this come to be once again, and Jerusalem shining once again, and our being able to experience the joy of that. And with that, some of the language of this Haftarah found its way into our music and our song. We were no longer the sentries on the wall who had to remind God of this promise. We became the sentries or the singers who sang out these words, a vision fulfilled, something to rejoice about. And that's what we're going to take a look at. That's what we're going to take a look at here, how some of these words found their way into other places. So the first comes from this verse 6. And here's the phrase here about the sentries on the wall. I highlighted in yellow the part of the verse that shows up in the song. I'll show you, I will play the song in a minute. You'll notice what it says here, right? Upon your walls, O Jerusalem, I've set sentries. And remember, right, they call out to remind God of the promise and the promise fulfilled. In the song, instead of Jerusalem, the words Ir David have been substituted. Ir David, David's city. Of course, biblically speaking, right, David conquers Jerusalem and builds it and makes it the capital of his empire, of his monarchy. And as you'll see in both of the things that we look at, some of the things that the lyricists do when they make reference to biblical material, well, sometimes they quote a verse as it is. Sometimes they quote a verse and make a little change, poetic license, if you will, and they substitute Ir David, a synonym for Jerusalem, so that it's a reference to the verse, but has a newness to it as well. Right, I'm going to move off the slides for a moment and switch to the next song. This song called Yasis Alayich has a chorus and 3 verses. The middle verse, oh, there we go. Hang on, the middle verse is the one that draws. The middle verse of the song is the one that draws from this verse from our Haftarah. And I found a version here from the Chazan at Shari Zion Beth El Synagogue, whose name popped off my screen. I'll find it for you later so I can give him credit for, he did not write this tune. It's a traditional melody, but this particular series, it comes from a series where I think for a run of weeks leading into Shabbat, he taught a different melody here in the video, and we're gonna hear the part that's our verse in particular. Oh, I lost my. Oh, here we go. We get to the right place in the video, and listen to the music and think about if it sounds familiar, if you can place it. All right, sorry. I was meant to start this one at the beginning. My bad. I'm going to take back what I said about verses. That's the next song. This is just all from the verse.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
All right, sorry, I'm pausing because I noticed as I'm listening, I'm enjoying. We got a shout out from someone who's a congregant here. We're going to come back to this. My introduction was right, but I played the wrong clip. My apologies for that. Mara will have to go back and edit the video before we post it. Just kidding. Sorry. Let me go back to the slides for a second. My apologies for getting confused here. Remind you of the verse that we're going to. I went to the wrong place. Sorry about that. You'll have to forgive me in this season of forgiveness before the holidays. Going back to upon your walls, O Jerusalem, I've set sentries, right? Al Chomotayich, Ir David Ifkadati Shomrim, reminding God of the promise. And here is the music I meant to play for this. All right, I'm stopping the share for a moment and coming back to you here. Apologies for the skip in the order of the clip there. My bad.
This is you, and this is your lingering hunch.
All right. Now I'm sorry that my video is playing something else.
So your hunch won't linger much longer.
Hang on.
Get a profit skipping NFL game day. And it's #1 sports book.
All right. Sorry about that.
No worries.
All right. There we go. Okay. There we go. Sorry, I told you the YouTube might throw in a commercial. The NFL is not sponsoring My Jewish Learning, and sorry about that. This is live, my friends, and this is the age we're in. I thought I had the tech all down. My apologies. All right, I'm back to you here. So Sisu at Yerushalayim, if you notice, the Efi Netzer singers are known in Israel from, I don't know, a classical period of contemporary Israeli music. If you're familiar with that era, that genre, right? A lot of choral music, a lot of upbeat male and female singers singing together. Upbeat, peppy, drawing from the tradition in lots of different ways. This was a song that started to become popular again in the period of settling the land of Israel, right? In the end of the 19th and the 20th century, it emerged. It was sung and danced in the land of Israel. And you heard the music there. If it's, you could give a shout out. If you have memories or thoughts or, something about that song, if it's familiar to you and it echoes something for you, you could throw your comment about it in the text. You see here a verse from the Haftorah that talks about, in its original context, the sentries being placed in Jerusalem on the walls of the city to call out to God, to remind God of the promise to restore Jerusalem to its former glory, now shows up at a time where people have taken into their own hands the restoration of Israel. It's still a prophetic hope, right? People have gone to build the land, but the people who sang this song were the ones who were motivated to bring the redemption on themselves, right? A debate in early Zionism between the Zionists and the anti-Zionists were, should we do something to restore the land ourselves? Religious anti-Zionists said, we should not be doing that. We should not be moving to Israel. We should wait until God brings redemption, until God brings the Messiah, until God makes it possible for us to go back to Israel. And the secular and the religious Zionists said, nope, this is our time. The secular Zionists were motivated by nationalism, wanting a nation state like what other nations had, especially those coming from Europe. Nationalism was on the rise, and nation states in Europe wanted their own land. The religious Zionists said, but we don't, maybe in a prophetic way, we don't have to wait for God. We can help push God into action, sort of like Isaiah said in this Haftorah. And we can move to Israel, and by moving and building and doing our own part to restore the glory of the land, we can force God's hands to join in the process. So the religious Zionists said, we're going to start to make the redemption happen, and we're going to force God's hand. And the music of this song, taking it from Isaiah, could be embraced by both groups. Those who said, we are the sentries, not just going to Israel to sing out and remind God, but we're going to Israel to build, right, to build the walls, to restore Israel the glory, and to sing and dance and rejoice there, right? The name of the song, Sisu et Yerushalayim Giluba, right? Rejoice with Jerusalem and celebrate in it, comes from a different verse, maybe from different echo, from a different place. But it's a collection of different verses that say, that celebrate the joy and restoration of Jerusalem, and it's people coming back. And the new context of the song then is taking the words of the prophet and saying, we're making this prophecy alive and real today, and we're going to make that happen. And it became something that in its newer day, it had an anthem quality to the early Zionists and those who went to build the state of Israel. I see that Hannah says she has great memories of this song herself. I do as well. I remember learning it as a young kid and singing it at camp, and it was something that has a Zionist element to it and tries to take the words of the prophet that look to the future and use it to celebrate in the present. So that's the recontextualization number one. Now, number two, I'm going to go back to the slide for second verse, and then we'll go back to Cantor Adam Stotland's song. Thanks, Tammy, for giving the shout out to your own cantor. It's good. It's always good to play some Jewish geography when we do this. Let me go back to the slides and show you the next verse that I have here. Well, hang on just a second. Oh, here we go. Got to get the right tab and share the music. Thank you forever for the person who called out in the chat for the patience for the tech pieces. I appreciate it. I'm getting better and better, but I'm pushing my limit for you guys today. Here, I'll make the next verse big. So the next verse, I'm going back in the Haftarah one verse, but I wanted to do the Pioneer days first before this. This verse, right, has the love metaphor. As young men embrace a maiden, your children shall embrace you. As a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so too will God rejoice over you. It's a verse that talks about the love affair between God and the Jewish people, and puts into the context of young love between young men and young women, or a bride and groom. And this verse shows up for us in a couple of contexts. Context number one is the wedding itself, where if you've been to a Jewish wedding, it's often part of many bands call maybe the Hora melody, where you might just hear it without the words, just the melody itself for the rejoicing and dancing of the bride and groom, but you might also hear the words as well. And now we're going to go.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
All right. So once again, if you have memories of this song or images of this song, you could throw it into the chat. I just want to note here, like I said before, and I'm foreshadowing the other context that's coming, in the song itself, you'll see here I have a selection from the liturgy, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But while the verse in the Bible from Isaiah says, "Umsos chatana kala," right, as a bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so too we rejoice. God will rejoice over you. So too will God rejoice over you. In the song, and as it shows up in the liturgy, as I said, we'll come back to it in a minute. Um, the verse flips, and we see the second half first, right? God will rejoice over you like a bridegroom rejoices over the bride, and the form of the verb in the second part, right, instead of umsos chatana kala, it says kimsos, right? It makes it, instead of a prediction of the future, it makes it into a simile, right? God will rejoice over you the same way a bridegroom rejoices over a bride. It's similar, very much similar image to what we see um, in the original context. It just flips the language a little bit of, again, I guess, poetic license or prophetic license, I guess, where you see there, where the verb is flipped. So in the context of the wedding, which is a new, brings up a whole new context here for this. And this verse is pulled out of Isaiah, in some ways taking the metaphor of the verse, right? The restoration, the return to Israel, the return to the covenant, the return to our relationship with God will be like the relationship between bride and groom. That gets taken and brought into a setting that's not about Israel, but brought into a setting that's about the wedding. And this is a song that's played and sung by Jewish bands and other bands at weddings. I think it's in mixes that sometimes the DJ will play. In my day, as my friends were getting married, this is the song we would sing, like after the half-hour dancing with the band and doing the hora, when the band stopped to take its first break and maybe they could serve the salad. Right as the band stopped playing, this is the song we would sing to try to keep dancing and get the band to come back and play so we could dance with the bride and groom more. I don't know if you've seen that at weddings, but it was a great joy when the crowd could make the band come back and play. Fulfilling that part of the metaphor, that piece of, jumping off the metaphor that's in Isaiah's original piece that says, right, the relationship of between God and the Jewish people is a love affair like that of a bride and groom. And we call that up when we're rejoicing with the bride and groom, and both as a way to really demonstrate the joy of a wedding, the joy of a bride and groom and their community celebrating together, but also to recognize in that moment that part of the wedding ceremony is not just a celebration of the couple themselves. It's about their couple building, Bayit Ne'eman B'Yisrael, building a Jewish household. And part of that is bring God into the equation, right? The rabbis and the Talmud say, right, that a marriage has three partners, right? The two partners who are getting married, and God also, that God is a participant in that holy union. And some of the joy that God extends to our people as a whole is also God extends to individual couples, individual households, individual families, individual homes. So we take these words of Isaiah out of the context of the Haftarah, right, out of Babylonia, out of the return to Eretz Yisrael, right, out of that building Israel in the Zionist era, and we place it within the celebration of each and every wedding by singing that song as part of our festivities, as part of our dancing. A second context where this appears, I had on that last slide, which I'm going to go back to right now, which is one of the verses of the Chadodi, which we sing as part of the Friday night. We sing as part of the Friday night liturgy, Kabbalat Shabbat. Right? We have every day, right? A Jewish day starts in the evening. We have 3 prayer services: evening prayers at night, the morning service at dawn in the morning, and the afternoon service sometime in the afternoon. Before Shabbat, when we're relaxed, when we have more time, when we're bringing in the Shabbat bride, there's the bride metaphor again, which is here in the Chadoti. We spend extra time reciting some psalms, And the Jewish mystics and Tzfat brought this multiverse song Lecha Dodi into the Friday night service that draws from the Bible and many of the prophets in many places. And while the chorus, Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala, right, come beloved to greet the bride and let us receive the Shabbat, there it equates the Shabbat to the bride. We have the Shabbat bride that when we bring in Shabbat, it's almost like, right, that same love, that same union between bride and groom happens between us and Shabbat. And many of the verses of the Chadodi make reference to the prophets. And this verse from the middle of the Chadodi quotes again this verse, the same song we just heard. The first half of the verse has a whole different metaphor that draws from a verse in Jeremiah that says part of the relaxation on Shabbat is that our troubles will be far from us. And it taps into a prophecy of Jeremiah that says that our oppressors will themselves be destroyed. Instead of oppressing us, right, what they try to do to us will happen to them, and those who would devour us will be far away from external threats. That the peace of Shabbat is a vision of the world where we don't have external threats. And then it's an interesting coupling, this sort of external threat and no destruction, coupled with rejoicing over the bride and the groom in this verse, but drawing from two different metaphors, two different prophets, and then brings in here that God will rejoice over us like a bridegroom rejoices over his bride. Again, like Lecha Dodi, bringing in the bride and groom metaphor that says when we bring in Shabbat, part of what we're doing is we're celebrating this union with God and or Shabbat. That's similar to that joy that the newlyweds feel that they bring into their house. And we sing this as well. And the clip that I played you at the beginning, and I'll play as we go out at the end, after we wrap up in a little bit, is one of many, 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 many tunes for Lecha Dodi that we sing. But they're a new melody that I think captures a lot of joy and some powerful music. The music of Josh Warshawski and the group he assembled to record that for one of his albums. But if you're a Friday night synagogue goer, this verse from this Haftorah this week is not just part of the Haftorah that you're here Saturday morning this week at Shul. It's a regular weekly occurrence in the context of Shabbat and Shabbat joy. Also far, also distant from its original context. But with echoes of it and echoes of the prophet Isaiah. To close down that slide, come back to you. Awesome. We're gonna have some time left for questions, which is always good if you have them. So to sum up where we've gone, we took a brief look at the verses from the middle of this week's Haftarah and where they are in the original context, and recognize that when we read it tomorrow, our context is not the same. The audience at synagogue tomorrow is not the same as Isaiah's, or second Isaiah's original context, but still the words ring out and can uplift us in their own way in this day. I wonder in this tough year for the Jewish people and for Israel and for Jerusalem, what the image of centuries on the wall protecting Jerusalem, restoring Israel to the glory it should have, and the feeling of God's presence, how it will ring for us different in this year post October 7th, right? Each year, the beauty of our biblical text is each time we read them, they get reread in the new context that they're in. But we also see how from this Haftorah, many opportunities for Isaiah's words to come alive, both for the settlers of the land of Israel in the contemporary era trying to rebuild the state, the Zionists who are there, who are trying to build the state for themselves and make Isaiah's prophecy come to be, and to think about both at weddings and on Shabbat, how we can feel, whether in Jerusalem or not, the joy that Isaiah hopes for, prays for, calls us to call for it till God remembers it. And we join in that process by calling out in those ways as well. Let me pause there and take some of your questions. Hannah, I see your hand is up. So Mark, can you help if Hannah, oh, there you go. Hannah's unmuted. Ask
Okay,
or-
all right. Now this may take long, but even a word about it would be incredible. And thank you so much for your class. It's been great.
Thanks.
I don't want this to be the last day. Anyway, okay. So there's 7 Haftorah of this journey that we're going through, and that's obviously incredible. Can you compare it, say just even one little thing about comparing it to the 7 weeks that we're counting the Omer?
Oh, sure. So the Omer, for those who might not know, biblically starts with weeks counting between the wheat harvest and the barley harvest. The Torah talks about on the second day of Passover, an offering of new grain is brought to the temple, and we start a countdown from the wheat harvest to the barley harvest, which happens around Shavuot, 7 weeks later. And we have a different 7-week period that's in our calendar that happens in the spring, whereas these Haftarot happen, end of summer into fall. Sure. So there is a lot here. 7, of course, is a number of completion, not just in Jewish culture, but 7 dates back to many ancient cultures, starting with the establishment of the 7-day week, which not just is, set up in Genesis chapter 1. It's part of the creation story, but scholars have seen that most ancient cultures had some sort of 7-day cycle to count time, right? We don't see 5s and 7s and 5s and 10s and 12s in other cultures. 7 somehow is a human piece. Might have to do with that the lunar cycle is about 28 days. It's really 29 and a half, but 4 weeks make up, right? If you're dividing 29 and a half into 4, you get weeks of about 7. And right, so a week is about a quarter of a lunar cycle. And, in the ancient world, of course, the moon helped us mark time. And in the Bible and in Jewish texts, 7 marks, a round number that means wholeness and fulfillment. So we see that with the 7-day of the week cycle that ends with the 7th day of Shabbat. There are many other 7s, right? The Omer itself is 7 weeks of counting 7 days. So it's like a 7 times 7 of 49 days counting, and the 50th day starts the new cycle of Shabbat. The Bible has a 7 Yovel cycle of years, where we have 7 cycles of years, of 7 years adding up to 49, and then the 50th. And here we see it as well. So what the Omer and the Haftorah cycle have in common is we're marking 7 weeks. The Omer in its origins was agricultural. In the rabbinic era, especially under Roman persecution, the Omer was a challenging time for the rabbis historically, and the rabbis made the Omer cycle a time of sadness. And in fact, the first 33 days of the Omer, it's traditional not to get married and not to rejoice with the bride and groom until Lag BaOmer, which was a celebratory day for the rabbis, which we talk about another time. I'll leave that out of this explanation. So in some ways, there are some connections between these 7-week cycles of contemplation, of looking at, of suffering, although it's different context in the 2 places. But you're right, Hannah, to point out 7 weeks of 7 days. We see that a couple different times, a couple different places in our tradition, and these are a couple. So thanks for bringing that up. And that's a brief version of that. I imagine, I'm 100% sure that on My Jewish Learning on the website, you could Google the Omer and find some articles about that as well. Kathy.
Hi, good morning. Thank
Morning.
you. Really interesting class. Let's see, what was I going to say? Now I completely forgot. Oh my gosh. It just went out of my heart. Go to someone else and I'll think back. I can't
Okay,
believe
that's
it.
fine. No worries. I've been there. If
Okay.
we could forgive my my playing of the NFL commercial off of YouTube, we can certainly give you a moment to recollect your thoughts. Other thoughts, other questions, other comments about Isaiah, about this Haftorah, about the music we heard today? The floor.
I
Oh,
remember.
I think Kathy remembers.
all right, come on back, Kathy. Well done.
Wow. Okay. So I've been attending temple for the last 15 years, every Friday night and every Saturday. And we dance and we sing to Lachadodi, and I know it's about welcoming the Shabbos bride and looking to the east and Spot and the whole thing. I never knew it was from the book of Isaiah. And that's what I love about Judaism, is that every time you look at the Torah, you learn something new. So here I am, 15 years later. Now, tomorrow night it's going to be a different experience for me. So thank you.
Oh, sure.
Beautiful.
Mhm.
I would say, Kat, so that's a great point. And like I would say the poet who wrote Lecha Dodi, right, lived in an era before YouTube and commercials and television, all the culture we consume. And I would say the ways in which the poet and those in his community and Spot knew the Bible, I meant, right, it was a text that they knew so well and by heart and could draw references to it. I want to note that while that one line that we looked at today is from Isaiah, you could go through each of the paragraphs of Lecha Dodi and see lots of references to lots of different verses from all over the Bible. I might suggest to you, Kathy, if you want to go onto Sefaria.com. One of the sections there is liturgy. If you click on liturgy and you click on Shabbat, you click on Friday night service, and you click on Lecha Dodi, you can click on each of the paragraphs of Lecha Dodi and go to the place where it shows you references to the Bible, and you can come up with your own list of Lecha Dodi, right? All the references from all the verses of Lecha Dodi and where they're from. And that could be even, and maybe it'll be a future Mind Jewish Learning class, all the verses of Lecha Dodi and where they come from and what we can learn from them. So it's not just this connection from this one line. There are dozens in that piece of liturgy. And it is some of the magical piece that you sit in synagogue, sit in the class, and someone makes you a connection between two things that you weren't aware of. And it's about the richness of the way that all of our texts are woven together. It's one of my favorite things too. So thank you for that. All right, Nathan.
Hello, thank you. I have a question, and I hope it's not viewed as showing off, and it's might be a little obscure.
Go ahead. Obscure is great.
Yeah, a few weeks ago, someone in my community gave a class on the typology of Teshuvah, and in it he included the story of Eliyahu on Mount Carmel and the still small voice. And he brought immediately after it, and I still don't understand, a midrash from Sifrei Bamidbar that says that how can it be that God speaks with a kol gadol, a big voice, and malachei asharet, and a kol d'mama daka, and it's resolved by saying that on the voice of the malachei asharet, the ministering angels are with a small voice, as it says, Lo yechashu hamazkirim et Hashem al domi lachem va'al titnu domi lo ad yechonein va'ad yasim et Yerushalayim tehila ba'aretz. And that's the second part of Achol Motayach Yerushalayim Yifkat Yitrim Achol Motayach Ir David. And yeah, I don't understand this midrash, and maybe I could ask him what he meant by bringing. I don't remember. I don't know.
All right. Well, Nathan, that's awesome that you made the connection between a class you were in and this class, and referring to that same verse about sentries on the wall calling out. So you had lots of references there. I don't know if we have the minutes to connect them all together, but the story of Eliyahu talks about, right, Elijah the prophet. This story you referenced talks about how God puts on a sound and light show for Elijah, but when does Elijah really hear God's voice? In a small, quiet voice. And the question the Midrash asks, how can God both speak loudly and quietly? And one answer to that's different from what the Midrash has, that I would say is, we all hear God in different ways at different times. And sometimes God feels loud and present, and sometimes God feels soft and quiet, and sometimes God feels different. But what you noted is what the Midrash notes about the verse we saw today, right? The sentries who are placed on the wall to call out and remind God that redemption is part of the promise. Well, it seems in the original context, those are human sentries, human people to do that. And the way in which that verse was applied in some of the contexts we looked at today were about how we continue to be that voice. The rabbis sometimes look at that verse from Isaiah and say, it's not us who are reminding God. Maybe like, who are we to remind God to restore the covenant to us? That's not for us to do. Who are the sentries? The sentries are the heavenly sentries. But the people who are reminding God are not us, but the angels. And the Midrash says, God's voice, this Midrash says, God's voice is loud and powerful, like at Mount Sinai, like in other places. But when God's voice is quiet, it's not God's voice directly. It's the voice of God's ministering angels who are quieter, softer. And maybe if you're a ministering angel, when you call out to God, hey, God, you forgot something, go take care of this. You want to do that in a soft voice to remind God and do your duty to remind God of God's promises, but not too boldly so that you don't irk God. But I love that you brought that Midrash, and it was one of the things I looked at for today. And as I was studying this week's Haftorah, so I'm glad you mentioned it. So thanks for that. Deborah, go ahead.
Okay, and I think this will be our last question.
Great.
Thanks so much. This is another maybe nitpicky one, but I was struck by the verse where Israel becomes the crown in God's hand. And I wondered why the crown is in the hand and not on the head. And I was also remembering another verse, but I can't remember where. Is it in Isaiah where there are other places where we are God's footstool? And I was just wondering if you could say something about that, like those kind of metaphors.
Sure. So the Bible and the prophets, like all poets, use a whole variety of metaphors. And what I hear you saying is this one struck you as I don't know, different, didn't call out in the same way as some of the other ones. So I think you're referring to verse 3, right? You shall be right. You might be right. We, the people, are like a glorious crown in the hand of God, and a royal diadem, right? Diadem. It's a good word. I know that from Harry Potter, right? I think that's one. Anyways, that's one of the Horcruxes, right? A royal diadem in the palm of your God, right? So what you're noticing here is, right, these are things you wear on your head, but the verse says God's holding them in God's hands, maybe like a kingly scepter, or there are other things that God might wear in God's head. But here, these are things that God would wear on God's head, not hold in God's hand. But here, sort of the metaphor places these objects in a different place from where you would normally wear them. That's a great question, and I didn't think about that till just now, so I'm glad you raised that. I think the prophets and the Bible are comfortable with anthropomorphic images of God, giving God body parts. The rabbis sometimes are not. So depending on your image of God, if God is anthropomorphic, I mean, if God has human characteristics, like God might have body parts, like the mystics are parts of Jewish tradition that read that more literally. My first response is to say, like, since we're talking about God where the body parts are metaphors, it's less problematic to mix it and put the things that go on the head into the hand. But I would say we have plenty of metaphors where God wears where these things could be on God's head. And I would say that's an awesome question. What I would do to follow up was to try to see, like, to look at metaphors of crowns, and do a quick search, in the Bible, in the prophets, and see, do we see this mixed metaphor in other places, or is it unique here? That's an awesome question. And, in a day, looking at this Haftorah, if we focused on different metaphors, how they work and how they don't work, that would be something to definitely address. But I might say, Deborah, that as I give you that response, like, I think that's a stumper question for me today, and I have to go back to look at it.
Sorry for that.
No, don't
It just feels really different to have like the metaphor of us as like an object versus the metaphor of lovers.
Yeah, sometimes, yes, there's that also. Don't be sorry for it. The same way someone said before, when you come to a class, we saw 2 examples of people making connections between other texts or experiences in class. That happens. And what I love about our tradition and our texts is there are always more questions. and the new questions allow for. So, you know, if my Jewish learning comes together next year to look at Isaiah and do these Haftarot again, you know, now you have an assignment to research this and maybe come teach what you find. So that's, you know, that's also a great piece of our tradition in that it, our ability to engage with the text, to ask questions, to ask them to find meaning doesn't end. And that's why I'm so glad that here on a Friday morning, almost noon for me.
Thursday.
Sorry, Thursday. Thank you. With all the Shabbat stuff, I was in Friday mode, right? Sorry, on a Thursday, you know, the fact that, you know, 50 plus people, I think we were up to higher earlier, came together to study the Haftarah. It's just a great thing. Anyways,
So
thank
much, Rabbi.
Sure.
And thank you all for going on this journey with us and learning parts of the book of Isaiah. Later this afternoon, we'll be sharing all of the recordings, and I'll also include Rabbi Goldberg's source sheet from today. And we are going to send a survey. We'd really love to know what you took from this series. If you are interested in looking at more Haftarot, more texts in the Book of Prophets, I'm getting some head nods, so that's nice to see. And as always, we just really appreciate going on this learning journey with you, and we hope to learn with you again soon, maybe even tomorrow morning for Torah study. All right. If not, Shabbat Shalom, and thank you again, Rabbi.
Take care, everybody. It was good to see you all.
Bye-bye.